So Professor John Tucker is a computer scientist whose research addresses what can and cannot be computed by people and machines. Incredibly timely as I mark my essays and wonder about the influence of ChatGPT, is that the phrase? I can't remember. What the kids are using. He also studies the historical development of data and computing and the influence on society. He founded the Swansea University's History of Computing collection, and he's also an expert on the history and heritage of science and technology in Wales, and today he'll be talking about Price's place in that history and the history of science more generally. Very warm welcome to you, John. Do you want me to be doing the slideshow for you, or are you going to...
Let's try this.
I'll try this. So I'll be your
yes.
beautiful assistant here.
Yes, indeed. My glamorous assistant, as they say. Yes. Right, okay. Right. Well, I'm a working scientist with an interest in history, so the whole style and perspective of this talk might be rather different. More importantly, to use that wonderful metaphor of the bus ride, the bus trip. I love bus trips. I love them. I think that my own metaphor would be perhaps more aerial. And whilst I would love to say helicopter or plane, I think drone is perhaps a more appropriate one, particularly if you don't particularly empathize with what I'm going to say. Right, let's start. Right, well, that's me. We can move on now. Thank you. You see, this is what I mean by the itchy finger. I have an itchy finger when I give talks. Right, let's see, what have we got now? Ah, yes. These are all the topics I thought might be relevant for the lecture. And even I, after I got to 100 slides, thought maybe this bit at the end could be perhaps dropped on the grounds we'll never get through it all. But let's start with the next slide on histories of science. So the first thing you've got to understand is that science history has a certain sort of structure, which may be always contested and so on and so forth. But basically, there is an enormous world which very few people have really studied, and that is the ancient Greeks. It's mentioned everywhere, you see it everywhere, everyone cites it, but the number of individuals who've really studied this is quite small. There may be 100 books on Aristotle's politics. There's probably about 3 on Aristotle as a natural scientist of any value. But in addition to Aristotle, there is, of course, the scholastics, and this is a giant space. And it's not a space we're interested in. So things start to warm up from our point of view in the 16th century, because here science has an empirical vision. That's, of course, often associated with Bacon. But in fact, you can find most of the ideas that we take away from Bacon in the works of Robert Record, who wrote large numbers of practical books about how mathematical studies could be applied to the world's work. And so that practical ethos, that experimental ethos, is definitely quite widespread. So we see the vision, the orthodoxy, the canon of Bacon, and we move forward to the 17th century, where we see quite a lot of things, alchemy, things of this kind, and emerging, and again, a strong empirical thing. You can't do alchemy if you're not interested in experiments. You get nowhere, okay? You can write theoretical books about it, of course, and people do. So now we come to the 18th century. Now, for me, the 18th century is really an industrial enlightenment. So whereas, of course, the center of gravity of our meeting is very much about civil liberties and political structures and constitutions and the life of the mind in that sense, the reality is also there is a lot of things going on as well. And you need only take an interest in this thing called industry and commerce, right, to start to realize that that part of the 18th century is extremely important. Now, you bump into it peripherally. We casually mention that this person or that person had a scientific interest. This person or that person happened to run an ironworks, etc., etc., you see? And of course, there are thousands of these people everywhere. But the industrial enlightenment idea I like very much. And here science is really aligning with the world's work in some sense. And of course, this is relevant for us because I'm going to be talking about a side of Richard Price that is quite concretely, although it has a social motivation, it's quite concretely about financial services, as we would call them today. And this really is a major achievement. So in talking about Price the scientist, I think it's very important that you open a little space in your picture of the 18th century and imagine that if you look peripherally and turn around, you are confronted by an enormous financial and industrial complex beavering away and growing. Some of the things they trade are done highly professionally. Okay, so it's very important to get that view. Now then, and then of course you've got the Industrial Revolution, and I won't go into that. This is just part of the framework where science now really is full of curiosity. It gets so technical that it becomes self-governing. And that, the rise in technicalities, really you can say from 1848 onwards. Up to 1848, for example, at Swansea, there was a British Association meeting. 800 people come to Swansea. There's no railway train to get to Swansea. You have to go by boat from Bristol. And it's a wonderful meeting. All kinds of people are there. And it has a big social program. And it's a nice marker, if you like, for us here to see that. Now, you won't get that when it comes back to Swansea later on in the century. Far more technical, far more advanced. Okay. Thank you very much. Can we move right now? Well, of course, the 20th century, a huge improvement, a great maturing of what was done at the late part of the 19th century, and then the war comes. And now suddenly science is in your face. It's never going to be the same again. It is increasingly an intimate mashup of technology, industry, and politics. And the current culture of talking about it is difficult to unpack that. Now, those things are issues for another time and not for today. But it's quite a fascinating transformation that the war has made. Okay, let's move forward. So you could say, well, what is the history of science? Well, the history of science is going to be the history of things to do with science. And I've made a list here. Publications, institutions, people are being most important, of course, because we like to talk about people. We enjoy talking about people. And people are complicated and rounded and do all sorts of things. So normally, there's too much reality about people, if you see what I mean, for us to cope with. But I'm very interested in the local history of science, because when you look at things locally, suddenly things fall away, and you start to see things in the round. You start to see the interconnections. You start to see the whole person somehow emerge from behind the texts. Next slide, please. Right. Now, I'm making an observation here because I think it's really impressed upon myself, again, to this big question, which I've seen a lot of, and certainly Marion's talk made me think hard about, is why the hell do we forget everything in Wales? I mean, it's terrible to forget everything. Well, of course, it's nice in a way because it gives us something to do with our lives, so sort of recovering this, recovering that, you know, recovering all sorts of people. And many of the people here have done fantastic jobs of recovering things, a lot, and for whom we must be very grateful. But Van Bakel, who is a lovely historian of science in the Netherlands, terrific, made a lovely book about the history of science in the Netherlands, a modern book. The Netherlands is a big country, incredible scientific life in the Netherlands today, and of course, going back to the 17th century. Is that institutions are the terra firma under which we all stand when we try to do the history. And why? Well, because institutions somehow, and there are many of them, they hold things together. They allow us the past, the present, and the future. Hopefully they have archives and collections ultimately, and there are cultural traditions, living memories, and the communality that ultimately is the spirit of an institution gets formalized somehow. And now you ask the questions, where are the institutions of Wales? You see, that's the first thing you have to ask. And next slide, please. Yeah, no, go back a bit now, whiz anyway. The speed is good, but later on. When you need to put your foot down, I'll tell you, right? So the institutions of Wales are few and far between. They're relatively weak by British standards, never mind the American standards, of course. And some are very young. For example, It's the same year that Ethiopia managed to run up a learned society, so did Wales. Same year. So we have a lot of work to do in some ways to preserve our institutions and to make them much more prominent and strong. And whatever techniques you can cook up to do that will pay dividends in the future. When you go to the Royal Society, as we did when we founded the Learned Society of Wales, we made the observation that there were as many people serving as canapes at this party we were invited to as there were members of the Learned Society of Wales. And the only consolation is the coffee shop history of the Royal Society, which went on a long time in its early years. So these institutions need a lot of support. Okay, let's move on. Now, the key thing to point out about all this, though, is every generation, of course, has to write its own history. And I think E.H. Carr made this point very clearly in his little book in the 60s or 70s. I think he was at Abertawe at the time, about how the contemporary agendas affect the history. So you've got your sources, which we can go back to. You've got an older history, which is very important to understand where we're coming from. And then there's the present agenda. And in this talk, whether you notice it or not, the present agenda is very assertive. Okay? Because if I'm going to talk about price in his historical context, that's very good. I will try to do a bit of that. But there's a good reason for wanting to talk about price scientists now, and that has already been mentioned with ChatGPT. So let's remind ourselves of some of the things about price that will be a backcloth. So here's a wonderful picture. We've all seen it many times by West. I think West was an American portrait painter, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And it's a lovely picture. And we don't have that many pictures of him, but we've got this one. So next slide, please. This is where I first saw it in the flesh. Now, around about the time the Learned Society was being created, the Royal Society had an enormous grant, a gift from the Cavalli Foundation. And they thought, well, we need a glamorous location for the elite international scientific conferences that an organization like us should have. So they bought this, spent many, many millions on it, many millions, exhausted all the money of the Cavalli Center. And I was fortunate to be at a meeting very early on. And as you wander around and have a little look, I opened the door. There's the man. 5 years later, I was there again. I opened the same door. It was a cupboard. Never mind. When people really had their brain in gear, you could actually see it. In pride of place, because I can tell you now, only one or two of the great minds that the Royal Society is proud of appeared on the walls of this center. At least our man was there. All right, let's move on. So this is a reputation. I don't need to tell you very much about that. You know more about most of this than I would. But if you asked, well, what have we got? We've got these different roles that he played that we can write about and talk about. There are the cartoons, of course. There's lots of scholarship now, and it's increasing by the minute here. But I wanted to point out the last line. I don't know if there's a statue. Now, if there was some younger people in the audience, they'd get their phone out and be able to answer the question, how many statues of Priestley can we find in the UK? Can I make this a challenge for someone with a mobile phone to find out how many statues of Priestley can you find in the UK? Not very challenged. Come on, get your phones out. Sorry. Anyway, let's carry on. No statue yet. Let's move on. So this, of course, is probably not unlike the world that he was born into. This is a picture from 2012 of the farmhouse at Llangainia. And I've got a lot more pictures of what was like inside, which is just a complete wreck. Okay, and it's a nice big plot, but and well worth seeing. But if you go there now, has that sort of gloomy air that the 18th century needs a little bit of touch of that. Let's move on now. If you go there now, you get £800,000 worth of agreeable thing, which totally disturbs the house price average for the village. Right? And I couldn't resist taking pictures inside that from the estate agent, just in order to see what the hell they'd done with it. And of course, once you're inside, it's much nicer to live in, because the other one was a wreck. But these things are around. Anyway, we move on. And then I thought, well, what kind of life, chapel life, did people have in those times? And I was reminded, of course, that a late chapel in St. Fagans is this one that I've been in 1,000 times over my whole lifetime. Well, not over my whole lifetime, because I think it arrived in 1958. But it's a barn, converted barn, beautifully converted barn. We're very proud of it, and so on. And these are the sort of places that these dissenters, at least in Wales, might reasonably empathise with, and so on. So let's carry on with that. That's a late one, remind. That's much later. Now we start to see recognition. This beautiful house and its recent plaque. Carry on. These things. And then you've got all these media things that require quite a lot of things. But I wanted to have some of these up because of Stanhope. I'm going to be coming to Stanhope. So I won't go into the historical meaning of these things because, first of all, you may well know it. And secondly, I got too many things that I need to say on the scientific front. But clearly this person was really very, very visible and well known. Carry on. And this one is, of course, the famous one everyone uses. And it has, in particular, this marvelous thing, the atheistic revolutionist in his midnight calculations. So the first point is that whatever these cartoons are about, they're fully aware that the guy was a calculator. That's the next slide, please. And here we have Price down here, where he is gone. And again, calculations are somewhere in that drawing. I've forgotten where exactly. I'm sure Marianne would remember. And so on. Carry on. Oh, no, it's this one. This is it. There's a book of calculations on here. So the assignment of Price, whoever he is and whatever he is, although in many ways you'd expect him to be some sort of background consultant in a complex world that most people had nothing to do with, somehow it's very visible that this person calculated. So he has clearly got this reputation. You know? So much so that it needs to be put and mentioned all the time. Let's carry on. And of course there's this wonderful plaque. And carry on. And more importantly than any plaque is this one, because this one is in Bridgend. And when I was in Bridgend, I would go to the public library and I would walk up the steps, and on my left was a plaque to the harpist of Queen Victoria. I've forgotten his name, I regret to say, but I should know it. And on the right-hand side was Richard Price. So someone had cared. By the way, perhaps someone knows who put up that wonderful monument to David Williams in Caerphilly, because that's a very impressive obelisk by the castle, which I think is a beautiful thing. Anyway, this is quite important. Incidentally, later on in life, I found out that our dear harpist from Queen Victoria, as a child, was spotted as a musical prodigy by Lady Lovelace, the person who now is regarded as the person who wrote a text on computer programming. A nice touch, I thought, if ever there was a destiny to know this stuff, you see. So keep your eyes peeled, you never know. Carry on. Let's move on. Oh, yes. Well, here, of course, there's lots of other things on the right-hand side, many ways in which he was regarded. For example, obviously, we always mention the Washington Doctor of Laws from Yale College. He was an honorary citizen of the United States, freedom of the City of London, and all this sort of thing. I couldn't find an image of any of those things. So I thought, well, I'll look up Yale. So you bump into a nice family snap of the Yale family at play, which I think belongs in the great collection of British art in Yale University. And the picture is regularly referred to by this name. Yale came back to Britain and lived in a house called Plas Grono, which is in Wrexham, demolished now. And in that, the ironmaster Wilkinson had his home, and his daughter Mary married Priestley. So a small world, eh? Small world. Carry on. Oh, I like this picture particularly because of the page, of course, because I think we must remember all the time that whilst we talk about slavery, you don't live it, and we don't know what this means. Probably if we had a holiday in Kabul, we'd get a feeling for it. But I think at the moment we have to remind ourselves how just absolutely normal this stuff is. It's not surprising. And since most of the people we hear about are people who spend their time writing things down and getting them printed, they are hardly representative of the people of the period. Anyway, of course, there's excellent scholarship around, and there's more to come if you carry on. So we know a lot about price in some sense. And now we get to the science. So if you move to this. So already in Thomas's book, there's 42 publications listed. And in particular, the ones I'm interested in are 9 papers in the Proceedings of the Royal Society. So this is this institutional remark. I'm already sucked into the idea I'm in the hands of an institution to some extent. Right? And in fact, there are 2 on probability theory, 5 on life assurance in different periods, 1 on the transit of Venus, and then 1 on light from bodies in combustion, which is a briefer thing. Now, in the talk, I thought I would concentrate ideally on the probability theory, because it's quite relevant to today. That's what I like about that. But the life assurance is probably far more important in many ways. Let us move forward. Thank you. So the 2 probability papers have these titles: an essay towards the solving of a problem in the doctrine of John by the late Reverend Bayes, and then a follow-up 2 years later. So we can move forward. There are 2 nice papers. You can download them from the web and have a look at them. So we move forward. Of course, writing these papers had an effect on price because they were very technical and very important and widely regarded to be important. And part of my talk is to explain why, historically at the time, why they're important. And I think we'll get there if I am careful. But the important thing here is that price becomes a fellow of the Royal Society, and there are many names we could look at here, but of course the big star is Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the nominators for his membership. And Franklin, of course, was very well known in London and very well known in the Royal Society, and he even won, of course, the Copley Medal for his work on electricity. We'll come to that. Carry on. So the probability papers established his entry into the Royal Society. And so now suddenly there was a sort of situation where this subject had been connected to his name. And as we will see later on, if you knew anything about probability theory, you knew something about life assurance, because this mathematical subject, which was written by many people in and around that time, all of these people either spent a lot of time or a little bit of time on the questions of life insurance. So, and in particular, pensions, of course. So his other great achievement, which would be worthy of note, is, let's say, summarized in this book, which goes observations on reversionary payments and schemes for providing annuities for widows and persons, and also the stuff about the national debt. So we have this wonderful fat book, 2 volumes, many editions. The last 3 editions are revised by William Morgan, his nephew, who we'll also meet shortly. And it's a major book. And it's written in the classic form of problem, solution, you know. And once you get into the swing of this, you begin to see how complicated this is, if you see what I mean. Right, now let's move forward. So I'm basically arguing now here for today that probability theory is extremely important and is certainly enough to make price known to school children. No problem. And then, of course, the insurance and pension trade, which, of course, is based on the dire state of economic stability that was around at the time. It was a social act to do something about this. Destitution and things of this kind, which are still with us in many ways, needed something done about them. Right, well, we've missed a slide there about that, but I wouldn't worry about it. One of the main things that will pop up in our talk is the previous slide. Let me just mention it. If you can go back, there we are, the Northampton tables. These things were introduced in these books, and in the 4th edition were expanded and played a very important role for about 100 years in the design of insurance, as we will see in a minute. And it's all about data. So the first thing you need to notice about this is that it's tabulated data, and it's about people living and dying at different ages. So someone is a certain age, how many people are alive, how many people are dying at that age. So you're documenting age of death. Okay? So suddenly things of this kind become a very important input into the kind of calculations that Richard Price is about to do. So shall we move forward? So in brief, without going into anything, one can say straight away that one would say, well, what is the scientific legacy of Mr. Price? And the answer is, well, essentially, life assurance, as we know it, began in 1762, essentially, but when it was founded on the business, when the company really founded its business on Price's mathematical guidance. And then 10 years after the probability papers, the book on, the textbook, if you like, on pricing, pensions and so on, comes out that we've just seen. But in order to do that, you can draw from it two things. First, you can draw from it that there's an enormous interest in the way data is collected and the need for thinking about that. What you do with the data, because very little data that you collect, you leave alone. You start calculating it, you average it, you smooth it out, you decide this is an outlier. So there's always things going on, even when you think you're just measuring. And then, of course, really calculating more complex stuff and interpreting the answers. So this is a big job. And when you consider there are millions of pounds in the money of the day involved in the equitable, and when you involve the fact that these people have to pay, and when you remember the South Sea bubble disaster on pensions, because people were buying pensions from the government, and the government were providing these annuities, and the government started to think, well, don't like the look of this. We'll have a discussion with the company, and in exchange for trade agreements, for monopolistic trade agreements, the company took over the pension debt that was currently in the government. The company probably was very happy now they were trading, making more money, very rich, and they were probably thinking, hang on a minute, we got all this debt here, we'll swap it for shares. So suddenly people started to say, you got all this money with us. Heavens, you don't need money, have a share. And of course, the company goes bust and a lot of people don't get their annuities. And so there's a lot of mess to be cleaned up. Anyway, let's carry on. Oh, no, this is a very important remark. One of the things that I think is very important about Price is that you have a masterclass at scale and in the real world of the quantifying spirit, which is so characteristic of the 18th century. So if I said to you earlier in this talk, think of the 18th century as a century of industry, I would also say to you then intellectually, think of it as a century of quantification. It is everywhere where you look. It's absolutely everywhere. And of course, science loves quantification. At least later on it did. Priestley wasn't so hot on it, which is where Lavoisier comes in, of course. Right, let us move forward. Thank you.
My finger's going to speed up a bit now because we've got 10 minutes. Okay?
You could, live the dream, right. Let's carry on.
And lunch will get cold.
Well, lunch, well, we don't need food, we love science, come on. Let's carry on then. Well, this is a famous quote you may well know when there's a letter to Richard Price from Priestley, and or rather, countering that he'd already communicated with Franklin, and in particular, writing to one of you is like writing to all of you, which sets up this circle. So let's move forward. So who's in this circle? Well, of course, there's Priestley, and they're very prominent. And in fact, as we've been hearing, Priestley has become a major figure, and I suppose we could measure it by number of statues. No one has yet managed to find this out. I do hope.
I was distracted because there was a talk going on.
Ah, you're so sweet, Randy. Thank you so much.
I found 5.
That's more like it. Right, come on. You multi-processor, you. Multitasker, sorry. Right, well, there's Mr. Priestley. And he is a very important figure, of course, and reading his life is a very valuable thing, and there's a lot of it. There's a lot of his life. Let's carry on. And what is Priestley's science? Well, first of all, there's this wonderful book on the history and present state of electricity from 1767. And there were about 4 or 5 people that really communicated with Priestley when he was writing this book, and one of them was Price. The other one is Franklin. And in particular, there's, of course, the famous work, why he is remembered in the school, or at least was last time I looked, because of the discovery of oxygen. The word oxygen, of course, comes from Lavoisier, but he also discovered all these other gases, ammonia and so on. So there was a major set of achievements in the chemical world by Priestley. Now, those of you who've been reading Priestley know that he really, really writes a lot. And in fact, often it's fascinating. I've recently been studying Swedenborg, and I found it very interesting to read a fat book by Priestley on why Baron Swedenborg's religion should be castigated and generally think, unlike Wesley, who just said, well, Swedenborg's mad, so why bother? Right, anyway. But the key thing about him is that he had 6 years at Bowood. And there he was the companion to the second Earl, first Marquis. And of course, that man became Prime Minister for a while, had to clean up the American Revolution, the peace talks, but of course traveled a lot. And it was through that he met Lavoisier in Paris. So let's move forward. Fellowship of the Royal Society, yes, we know this. Franklin, so on, Price. You can see the clique. The Learned Society is working a little bit like that in the early years, as you might imagine. Let's carry on. I've got to rush now and do my best. Oh, forget them. Carry on. Right, Franklin. Oh, my God, what a topic. Oh, it's exhausting, Franklin. But he was a printer. That's the key thing there. And founded the American Philosophical Society in the University of Pennsylvania. I was in England for about 15 years or something like that, off and on. And so on. So very interesting. But he has a really serious scientific credentials, and this is the basis of his thing. So we already see that calculating in those silly cartoons. And for Franklin, my God, he had a reputation for a man of great learning, as well as being an enormous fixer, of course. Let's carry on. So, no, hang on. Yeah, carry on. So this is a slide which is really about the conservation of electric charge and making sense of electricity. And this work, thinking of it as a fluid, trying to make it, in fact, much more realistic. The work on lightning meant that we are no longer subject to superstition. It wasn't the case that some mad deity was running around making trouble in the sky. It was just electricity, and therefore it must have a natural cause. These are things that come out of that 18th century and thing. And there he's wearing his bifocals, of course, which he invented. And so much to say. Carry on. Thank you, Hugh. Now, the key thing here is that I. Bernard Cohen, who was somewhat of a doyen of science of Newton and others, of course, wrote his thesis on Franklin. And this was a really important change because he looked at the scientific legacy of Franklin, and suddenly it was found 2 things. One is that there's a lot of it, and secondly, that this was essentially his passport to authority in his middle years. And he did do that. So let's carry on there. Right. Oh, this is a nice thing about the friendship between Price and Franklin. Of course, when Franklin died, Price was sent a lock of Franklin's hair, and later when a mourning ring was created, and in particular, when Price died, a new ring was created in which their hairs are intertwined. and so on. So there's a lot of depth here. Let's carry on. And here's William Morgan. Now, I'm talking about his network, but of course, the nephew is incredibly important in the life of Richard Price in all sorts of ways. And a very, very worthy nephew he is, I think. He had much better luck with his relatives than Franklin, who, of course, was estranged from his son over politics. Anyway, so Morgan became the actuary quite early on because Price was an advisor to the Equitable Life. And he was there a long time. And his biography is written by Nicola here and is absolutely wonderful to read because it provides an amazing perspective on this other side of Price. You can really get inside there. And frankly, Morgan is interesting in his own right. I mean, there's no question about that. And let's move on. As you can see, portraits by Thomas Lawrence and so on. Everybody's doing rather well for themselves in this line of country. The Fellowship of the Royal Society, we passed that one on. Please, thank you. Oh, Cavendish. Oh, yeah. Anyway, Cavendish, of course, is a very great scientist, discoverer of oxygen and so on. Not oxygen, hydrogen. So Morgan did work of a very experimental kind because that gang of Wilson and other people who helped Priestley with electricity are also in the background to some of this work that Morgan did. And what Morgan was doing was trying to study the problem, which one of them had already looked at, of passing current through a vacuum. Can electricity pass through a vacuum? And he wrote this very important paper and observed meticulously various odd changes. And there's no question about the fact that if you take low energy electromagnetic waves, you start to see that they are at the bottom end of the X-ray spectrum. So the argument that he actually encountered and discovered X-rays in an explicit way is defensible in this one paper. But you can read about it in Nicola's book, can't you? Then she can take the responsibility for all the claims they have made, you see. Right, anyway, let's move on. So we're dealing with a strong person. And of course, there's George Cadogan we've heard about him. He also wrote about electricity, a textbook, and a marvelous little account on this scientific table. It was intriguing to read that. Right, let's move forward. Right, now I'm finally getting to the main point of my talk is probability theory. Let's go and see how far we get before Hugh can't control himself anymore. Do you notice how I passed that on? Okay, so I need to get through this quickly. I'm a big fan of Philip Stanhope, second Earl, an incredible guy. He was taught by a man called Abraham de Moivre. Now, de Moivre is a big name, all right? And I got many slides about Mr. de Moivre later on, which presumably we won't get to, you know. But he really learnt this probability from there. And it was through Philip Stanhope that, through a friendship with Bayes, who was a minister at Tunbridge Wells, that Bayes, who liked mathematics, got interested in probability theory through this thing. Now, Stanhope is interesting. We'll whiz through Stanhope because I think it's a name that you need to register a little bit if you don't take an interest in it. Well, first of all, that's his home. And, of course, you'll recognize the name, Chevening. It's a famous centre for foreign secretary. And you have the Chevening conferences, the Chevening this, the Chevening that. It is a government thing. And there it is. It's been the foreign secretary's official home since 1978, so it's very nice. And that's where he lived, near Tunbridge Wells, 15 miles from Tunbridge Wells. And this is the Newton Memorial here. Right now, Newton is the big name in all of this. These are the Stanhopes here. So let's see what is said. Sacred to the memory of Philip Earl Stanhope, who, being fully cognizant of virtue, vigorously and loyally defended the ancient liberties of his county, or country rather, seeking neither praise nor reward. He passed his life in tranquil scholarship, with the utmost enthusiasm, pursuing and nurturing the liberal arts, and in particular mathematics, always uniting in himself a dutiful respect with brilliance and uprightness. So next time you're in Westminster Abbey and you are encountering Newton, just remember who's next door. Carry on. So Bayes, we got, forget that. All these people are in the institution. That's Tunbridge Wells. Of course, Tunbridge Wells was economically boosted by a man from Swansea, Beau Nash. I just sort of passed that on. Let's carry on. Oh, that was his house. And he's got a sign against his house, which is very nice. That's his chapel, obviously been renovated with a sign. That's his tomb in Bunhill, opposite the Wesleyan chapel. And of course, guess who's there? By the gate is Richard Price, so they ended up in the same place along with Blake and others. So let's carry on. Now, a couple of more slides, and then it's open season on me then, I think, right? So what is the theory of probability? Well, the theory of probability is a mathematical theory. It tries to measure, it's trying to sort of quantify, in some sense, what we don't know. And this is a tricky thing, because it normally expresses itself as estimating the likelihood or probability of an event. But really, probability theory is an elaborate logic for dealing with things we don't know. But when we say we don't know them, we actually give a number to have a sense of, well, we might know something, we may not know much, right? So you quantify your ignorance, your risk. And then what probability theory does is it provides a calculus, a logic for dealing with, well, if the risk for A is this and the risk for B is that, what's the risk for A and B? Or what's the risk for A or B? Or if I'm not worried about the risk for B, and I know it's going to happen, then what is the risk for A, knowing that B is going to happen? That's Bayes coming up, by the way. Right, let's move forward. Thank you, Hugh. Right. So all of this starts heavily with names like this. Halley wrote a very important paper in 1693 looking at the whole question of how you might try to guess your way through formulas, or algorithms rather, to calculate how much people should pay to have a pension of some kind. This is an extremely important man, this Halley. And in Alan Cook's biography of him, which is 400 solid pages, there's 2 pages on this paper. But I think from our point of view, this paper is seriously important. And in it, he managed to observe a stable city in Poland and find out in that city in Poland stable figures for the population, because you can't easily do calculations on collecting data. So there was data, and this data in Breslau was really very much something that he could work with, and he developed formulas. And he did quite complicated calculations as to how much you should pay per year. Of course, most people pay every quarter or every half year, so that's a much more complicated problem. And suddenly you get into this mode that there's one problem followed by another, followed by another, followed by another. Very, very complicated. Next one. So he is laying the foundations of it. Now, de Moivre was a very important figure. Here he is. And he wrote many, many things, and was a teacher, but also a researcher of great, great quality. And he wrote 2 things of interest to us: the Doctrine of Chances, which came in many editions, including editions after his death, and the Annuities upon Lives. And these two major works really set the scene. And he had quite a lot of influence, because, remember, Stanhope was a pupil of de Moivre. Okay, and Stanhope led to Bayes. Let's carry on. There's William Jones. We'll have to pass quickly over William Jones. And there's Newton. I mentioned Newton because the 3 people I've just mentioned, Halley, de Moivre, and Jones, were very friends of Newton, and they're the older generation. Price is young. Price is 4 years old when Newton dies. So we have this older generation here. And in particular, Those three were on the committee that was supposed to look into the priority of the discovery of the differential calculus with Leibniz versus Newton. And in particular, they show up again when Harrison's work on methods of finding longitude in the 18th century, they were on the committee that looked at the viability of his work and whether or not it should continue to be funded. When you start seeing these branching things out, I want to remind you all the time of this business that the 18th century is far more than some sort of struggle for civic life. The energy of the country is really quite all over the place. If you carry on a little bit. Well, Mr. Dodson was a pupil of De Moivre and was very important because he was the first mathematical mind that the Equitable Life Assurance Company employed. But he didn't get very far. And so they had a taste for this mathematics, which led them to Price. Let's carry on. And here's the base price theorem. Now, what's interesting about the base price theorem is that in an off-print found in Edinburgh some years ago, the full title of the actual article was not what is actually in the proceedings. And it included the word induction. And I'm sure your little spirits will rise, those of you who are in philosophy, because once you get induction, you get to David Hume and all sorts of other modern scientific discussions. So there is the blinking light on my dashboard. We've got as far as Hume. So like Moses, we are now looking over from this scientific world into the world of philosophical speculation. Can you indulge me just a couple of more pictures just to see if I can get to the right ones? Forget that, that's too technical. Oh, yeah, no, that's too technical. Technical.
We can pause and take it in if you like.
Yeah, no, you can if you want, but I worry about your health. Keep going. Any formula out. Oh, no, more. The point about Bayes' theorem here is I was going to give you an example of how it actually, how you develop spam algorithms based on Bayes' theorem. You see, and this is, and it's all over the place, including natural language translation. So this stuff is core. Now it's been in the A-level syllabus for statistics as part of the canon of probability. But this is absolutely everywhere in modern computing. And of course in various advanced forms of it. So I thought I'd give you a taste of it, but well, you've had a glimpse of it. Yeah, no more spam. No, we haven't got time for that. Come on, Hugh, come on. Yeah, that's what you do, this calculation, yeah. Aha, right, now stop. These slides are kind of valuable. Back to the French Revolution in a minute. Now, so probability is obsessed with elementary models of things when you teach it to the mathematicians. And one of the most important things is to have an urn with colored balls. And you imagine putting your hand into the urn and wondering what is the probability of having a white ball or a blue ball or a red ball? Or having two. Or what is the probability if I do it 5 times? 3 of them will be blue and 2 of them will be red. And you see the picture? It's infinite. This is exactly like life assurance, isn't it, Randy? Someone will come up with, can you give me a price for this? You know? So this is, of course, an 18th century urn with a few bally-like things in it. But what's important is that later on in 1781, and this is a very important year for Paul and others because of this question about price in Paris, Condorcet, who was extremely close to Laplace, made some beautiful remarks about base price. And it's summarized by this. The direct probability is you know what balls are in the urn and you're going to compute what happens when you take them out. Okay? This is not so difficult. But what happens if the only thing you know is what's coming out? How can you compute what might be in? And I say what might be in because you're looking for the probability of what's in. So you're now in the inverse problem of not directly calculating the probability of taking the ball out. You're looking at the inverse problem. Well, I got all this stuff coming out. I want to infer, I want to guess, I want to estimate what might be in the urn. And Condorcet observes that from this urn problem, which is the way these things are addressed, all physical and moral knowledge is of this kind. You have all these bits and bobs lying around, and you're looking for causes, you're looking for explanations, you're looking for structure that could possibly generate this. And since you won't know it, you'll be looking for a probability of it being the case. And that's already in 1781. And that is, of course, nowadays, and for many has been called statistical inference. And since statistical inference is the 19th century all over, and statistical inference is what goes on every time you get some activity on Google or recommended systems on Amazon, statistical inference is absolutely what we do. And it all comes very neatly down to this thing. Okay, Hugh, let's carry on. Go on, there you go, there we are. Hume. Now, I'm not going to, because how are you doing? Are you bearing up?
I'm okay. I'm not so sure about the food. So,
Don't worry about it. Don't worry. We live in a revolutionary times.
Should we say 5 minutes we finish, okay?
Yes. That's very generous of you, Hugh.
I'm a very generous man.
Oh, very good. I thought we were going to have a people's vote. Right, now, so. Of course, you know more about Hume than I do, but I met Hume when I started to read philosophical books as a student and met Karl Popper. Because, of course, the principle of induction was a big deal for Popper. He thought he was nonsense. But, of course, it's got a certain air about it. Now, let's move forward with Hume. So Hume's books, especially the inquiries, is of interest here. And he had certain aims of these books, which I needn't tell you about because you'll know these things from, I assume, your reading. But in particular, in there is the principle of induction, which is casts a huge shadow over a lot of scientific work as a philosophical principle. So we'll carry on about that. Thank you, Hugh. We'll forget Popper's criticism of it. But of course, one of the things that is to be found in inquiries, in a later edition of inquiries, is the chapter on miracles. And of course, Hume is basically saying cogent arguments as to why miracles can't happen, because a miracle is a definition of a miracle is something that is against natural law. Okay? That's, in order to define a miracle, you have to say something like, when you're dead, nothing happens in terms of rejuvenation. That's a kind of natural law. And so obviously if someone is now resuscitated, and you believe that, it's a miracle. So those are the sort of ideas that are defined there, and he carries on. So the question you've got then, how on earth do you get evidence that a miracle could actually take place? And this is a nice slippery notion, because he talks about no testimony could be sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact, which, well, and so beautiful rhetoric, totally empty nonsense, of course, but we like that, don't we? We like a bit of flurry. Carry on. Thank you so much. Now, Price took in the 4 dissertations this question and writes about it. But if you abstract it the way mathematical people typically love to do, they see the miracle problem as a testimony problem. It's just testimony, right? So the question is, you've got fallible people saying things. How do you deal with this? And Price's reply to the skeptical argument is a long footnote in which he applies Bayes' theorem. This is the very first time Bayes' theorem was ever applied to anything. And it is in a footnote about a calculation which he does numerically to show that if there is enough people that are more or less reliable, and they all say the same thing, the probability that it's true is higher than the probability that it's false. Now, this is kind of interesting because in the normal way in which we like to celebrate bits and pieces in science, without wishing to go into lift the bonnet, we love to track what's the first of this and the first of that. So we know Bayes' theorem comes from Price, that's no doubt about that. Later, Laplace, in his major works, very efficient mathematical books later, it's there. It's not used by anybody for 50 years a fact I typically use when I'm describing impact in the university system, by the way. 50 years later, it's actually really in use as probability has moved forward. But the first application is already in studying the problem of a miracle. So his answer is, you don't have to take all this waffle. Let's do a calculation using probability theory and see what that tells us. So I leave you to look up this footnote. It's very important. And if you want to have a good pub quiz question in amongst the elevated circles that you might move in, there's nothing like asking when was the first application of Bayes' theorem and what did it do? And the answer was answer Hume on the question of the impossibility of miracles. So probability says miracles are possible. This is a very nice point. Let's carry on quickly because there's an end point coming, my friends. Now, this problem never went away. And if ever you want to look at one of the biggest figures in the 19th century that again was forgotten about, but is now much better known, not least because we have stamps with his face on it, is Babbage. And Babbage wrote about lots of things. When his wife died, he gave up work on the first set of engines, and he wrote about everything. Travelled around, came to Merthyr, came to Swansea, did all sorts of interesting things. But one of the things he wrote about was life assurance, and another thing he wrote about was the problem of infallible things. And now we get a really definitive mathematical analysis in the modern style, which essentially confirms the observation that if enough dodgy people are saying the same thing, then it's probably true. It's wonderful to read this paper, because at no moment in this paper do you ever spot in all this mathematics that that's what it's about. But that's the triumph of mathematics, right? Hugh, you've been marvelous. Thank you so much. I think whatever's left now doesn't matter. Oh, this conclusion about how great Richard Price's legacy is in scientific work. And I think it is. And why I wanted to emphasize the modern dose in looking at history is that this talk is easier to give now than it would have been 25 years ago. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, John. Thank you very much.